In the dusty, forgotten archives of Hancock County, Georgia, there lay a ledger so secretive that local historians had sworn for decades it would never see the light of day. Not just a record of cotton yields or the daily labors of enslaved people, this book contained something far darker, far more enigmatic, a story that unsettled anyone who dared to read it. The entry, dated March 1851, was simple in appearance, a few faded lines in a brittle leather-bound volume, but the truth they revealed was anything but simple. It was not cruelty that startled researchers. Not the beatings, not the punishments, not the meticulous tally of hours worked from sunrise to sunset. Those were common in plantation records. No, what set this ledger apart was the story of one woman, a woman described in terms so disturbing that overseers refused to work near her, whose presence inspired fear, superstition, and a nameless dread among those who encountered her. Yet, 7 years after her arrival, that same woman would own the very estate that had once tried to conceal her, control its fortune, and orchestrate the burial of her master under circumstances so irregular that state officials intervened and then sealed the official report for more than a century. The events at Wikliffe Plantation were not the product of romance, rebellion, or the predictable tragedies that stained so many southern estates. What happened there was colder, deeper, more calculated, and more astonishing than anyone could have imagined. To understand how such a transformation could occur, one first has to understand the world. Sarah entered a world governed by rigid hierarchy, appearances, and unflinching order, where a single flaw could condemn a person, but ambition wielded with precision could reshape destinies. Wikliffe Plantation did not appear cursed. To any traveler approaching from the main road, it looked like prosperity carved into the rolling hills of Hancock County. 1,200 acres of prime cotton land stretched across the terrain, its boundaries marked by ancient oak trees whose roots seemed fused with the red Georgia soil. 15 miles southwest of Sparta, the estate was far enough from town to avoid gossip and city noise, yet close enough for neighboring planters to measure each other's success like men checking their own reflections. By the late 1842, Wikliffe had become one of the region's most consistently profitable plantations, producing over 300 bales of cotton each season, a figure that caused rivals to grind their teeth in envy. The main house stood proudly at the end of a quarter-mile driveway, flanked by towering oaks whose branches arched overhead like cathedral rafters. Greek Revival columns framed the front porch, broad, white, and polished, as if the house itself demanded admiration. Visitors often remarked that it looked more like the headquarters of an empire than a family home, and in a way, that was exactly what it was. Thaddeus Havford inherited the plantation in 1842 at the age of 31, recently widowed, burdened with debts left by his father. He could have sold the estate. Many men would have. But Thaddeus possessed a quality both feared and respected among planters, a meticulous mind. He tracked every expense, illness, harvest, and hour of labor with obsessive precision. In a world where most plantation owners delegated responsibility to overseers, Thaddeus trusted no one. He maintained dozens of ledgers, each representing a year of life at Wikliffe, from crop yields to births to punishments, written in careful, almost delicate handwriting. Visitors commented on the precision of his script, but rarely remarked that his home felt more like a library of accounts than a living space. The enslaved population lived in 2 rows of pine cabins, each housing 8 to 12 individuals, separated only by thin cotton curtains that gave the illusion of privacy. Families were close enough to hear each other breathe. The work bell rang at 4:30 in the morning, 6 days a week, and Sundays were reserved for mandatory attendance at services led by a circuit preacher. The sermons preached obedience, patience, and the promise of rewards in the afterlife, but in truth, obedience ensured profit, profit ensured power, and power preserved men like Thaddeus Havford. Hancock County society revolved around a small number of planter families who guarded their status like royalty. They attended harvest balls, courthouse barbecues, and dinners where alliances were savored as carefully as brandy. Outsiders were not trusted, Deviation was not tolerated, and mystery was unwelcome. So when Sarah arrived in October 1849, she was a disruption no one yet understood. Before her arrival, life at Wikliffe ran with clockwork precision. De la Poete, the housekeeper, a free woman of colour with steel in her spine, managed the domestic staff with flawless discipline. The overseer monitored the fields with strict efficiency. Thaddeus attended social functions when required, but preferred the silence of his ledger-filled study over the chatter of cocktail parties. His closest neighbour, Robert Crenshaw, owned an 1,100-acre property to the east. Their rivalry was polite yet unmistakable, measured in pounds of cotton, auction bids, and even the expansion of gin houses. Every success was matched or exceeded. Yet, behind the numbers and manners, the absence of a mistress at Wikliffe did not go unnoticed. Thaddeus's wife, Catherine, had died in childbirth 2 years prior, leaving a hollow no visitor spoke of. His sister Margaret offered repeatedly to relocate and run the household, but Thaddeus refused each time. He trusted only himself, and perhaps that isolation made him vulnerable in ways he never documented. The stage was set before Sarah stepped onto the property, and her arrival was almost ordinary, a slave coffle arriving late on a rain-soaked afternoon, exhausted from a 200-mile march in chains. A routine transaction, a note in the overseer's journal, hardly worth the ink. But no one could know that this single arrival would unravel the future of an entire estate. The woman standing quietly at the back of the line would one day dictate the fate of every soul who lived there. Her presence would become the final entry in Thaddeus Havford's meticulous life that he truly understood. History, however, does not announce itself. It often slips in quietly, with lowered eyes and muddy clothes, revealing nothing until it is too late. And that is exactly how the story of the so-called Abominable One began, with silence. Silence, and a man who believed he could read every secret the world had to offer, so long as he wrote it down. He did not yet know that some stories cannot be contained by ink. Some unfold slowly, quietly, until they consume the very people who try to control them. Wikliffe Plantation would soon learn that the most dangerous person is not the one who shouts, but the one who watches, remembers, and waits. And Sarah had been waiting a very long time. Some arrivals change nothing, slipping into the world like unnoticed shadows. Others arrive quietly but leave a tremor so deep that no one recognizes its magnitude until it is too late. And then there are the rare few, those whose arrival seems ordinary, unremarkable, even invisible, until the moment comes when history itself bends to their will, and the world can never look the same again. Sarah's first days at Wikliffe were almost invisible, a shadow slipping between the rigid routines of the plantation. The overseer barely noticed her, assuming she was like any other new arrival, weak from the journey, marked by exhaustion, and unlikely to disrupt the carefully ordered life of the estate. But Sarah carried a presence that even the most experienced overseers could not ignore. She spoke little, moved quietly, and observed everything with an intensity that unnerved those around her. Her skin, marked with irregular patches of pale tissue, drew whispers and sideways glances. People avoided her, unsure whether to fear contagion or some unexplainable curse. Yet Thaddeus Havford was not like the others. He had inherited control of the plantation, along with debts and responsibility, and he knew how to read what others overlooked. He noticed Sarah's eyes, alert, calculating, and strangely unyielding despite her apparent subjugation. Her quiet defiance sparked an intrigue he could not ignore. She was assigned to the kitchen house, a space where the work was grueling yet hidden from public view. It was a place of constant labor, peeling, chopping, cleaning, scrubbing, and keeping track of inventories that were essential to the household. But Sarah adapted faster than anyone expected. She learned to read the cookbooks, balance the records, and manage the smaller staff of household slaves with an efficiency that reminded Thaddeus of his own meticulousness. Yet what truly unsettled the plantation staff was her intelligence. She did not complain, she did not falter, she spoke only when necessary, but her words carried weight. Even the oldest and most skeptical among them found themselves taking notice, acknowledging her abilities in silence. The other enslaved people began to understand, slowly, that Sarah was unlike anyone they had encountered. She did not seek their obedience through intimidation, nor did she submit to theirs with weakness. There was a rhythm to her control, a quiet authority that inspired both fear and respect. In the evenings, when the sun fell behind the distant oaks, Sarah would sometimes stand alone in the yard, staring at the main house with an intensity that seemed to pierce its walls. Thaddeus, who often walked the grounds after supper, noticed this. One evening he approached her quietly, expecting fear or deference. Instead, he found something more unsettling, a look of careful calculation, as if she were not only observing the estate, but considering its every weakness. "You understand the work here," he said, testing her. Sarah did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him, eyes steady. "Yes, sir," she said finally, "and I will do it better than anyone expects." Thaddeus felt a strange chill. It was not arrogance, but certainty, a certainty that made him uneasy. Meanwhile, the rest of the plantation began to whisper. The Abominable One, as some had come to call her in hushed tones, was quietly rising in influence, and no one could explain how or why. Superstition mixed with fear. Some said her pale skin was a sign of dark magic. Others thought her survival was unnatural, as though she had been marked by something beyond the ordinary world. Children were kept away from her. Workers crossed to the other side of the yard rather than pass near her. And yet, Sarah never retaliated, she never threatened. She simply existed, calculating, learning, and quietly gathering knowledge of everything that happened within the boundaries of Wikliffe. Over time, she began to manipulate small aspects of daily life. Tasks that were once done poorly or with complaints now ran smoothly under her guidance. Supplies were accounted for perfectly. The domestic staff operated with a precision that no overseer could claim credit for. And when Thaddeus noticed the improvement, he could not attribute it to anyone else. At the same time, her mastery of numbers and inventory gave her insight into the wealth of the plantation. She knew which crops were most profitable, which equipment was in disrepair, and how small inefficiencies were costing the estate thousands of dollars per season. Slowly, imperceptibly, Sarah gained influence over Thaddeus himself. He began to consult her on small decisions. At first, he dismissed his reliance as necessity. There was no one else so meticulous, but he could not ignore the quiet authority she commanded. And then, small incidents began to occur that left the plantation staff shaken. Items missing from storage would reappear in unexpected places. Conflicts among workers were diffused before they escalated. Decisions made without consulting her were quietly reversed, as though her knowledge allowed her to anticipate every outcome. Whispers of the Abominable One's strange abilities spread beyond the kitchen house. Even Robert Crenshaw, Thaddeus's rival, began to notice irregularities. "Havford's estate runs too smoothly," he said to a visiting planter. "I can't imagine it's all his doing." The fear and fascination surrounding Sarah reached a turning point when a sudden accident nearly destroyed a critical shipment of cotton. A fire broke out in one of the storage barns, threatening hundreds of bales. The overseer rushed to extinguish the flames, but chaos ensued. Smoke filled the air, flames licked the wood, and the workers panicked. Sarah appeared as if from nowhere. Calm, deliberate, and commanding, she orchestrated the response. She ordered the men into specific roles, directed the water buckets efficiently, and prevented the fire from spreading to the main stock. By the time the smoke cleared, the plantation had lost nothing. The overseers were left dumbfounded. Even Thaddeus, who had observed the entire sequence from the veranda, could not hide his astonishment. He realized that Sarah possessed an uncanny ability to see every thread of cause and effect before it happened, to anticipate actions, and to orchestrate outcomes with surgical precision. From that moment, her reputation shifted. The whispers of fear became reluctant admiration. The Abominable One was not just surviving, she was mastering. She became a presence that even the highest-ranking staff deferred to silently. Over the following years, Sarah's influence continued to expand. Thaddeus, fascinated and perhaps wary, began to rely on her judgment more and more. She knew when to push him and when to hold back, guiding decisions that would increase the estate's wealth and stability. Her control was subtle, almost invisible, but absolute. Workers began to realize that resistance was futile. Any attempt to undermine her authority was quietly corrected before it escalated. Rumors of her uncanny abilities spread beyond Wikliffe. Neighbors speculated in hushed tones about how a woman once deemed abominable could now wield such power. They did not know that Sarah had learned the rules of their world, the hierarchy, and the hidden vulnerabilities of those who claimed to lead. She understood fear, ambition, and the human desire for control, and she used these to her advantage with relentless precision. By the 7th year, the unimaginable happened. Thaddeus Havford fell ill, his strength failing, his mind clouded by age and illness. And in the weeks before his death, it became clear that the control Sarah had been quietly amassing had reached a tipping point. She orchestrated the final arrangements, directing the burial, securing the estate's assets, and ensuring that the mechanisms of power remained under her hand. State officials were drawn into the investigation due to irregularities in the documentation and burial proceedings. Their reports were sealed, hidden away for over a century, leaving the truth of her mastery shrouded in mystery. And yet, anyone who had been present could not deny it. The woman once feared and ostracized had become the mistress of the plantation in every sense. Her journey was not born of violence or rebellion. It was born of observation, calculation, and an almost supernatural understanding of human behavior. She turned fear into influence, weakness into strategy, and invisibility into absolute power. By the time the records were finally unsealed decades later, the legend of the Abominable One had grown into something larger than life, a story of how a single, underestimated individual could outmaneuver an entire system designed to control her. And still, the whispers continue. Those who study the archives speak of her not as a myth, but as a calculated force, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous power lies not in strength or weaponry, but in patience, intelligence, and the quiet mastery of the world others take for granted. Yet questions remain unanswered. What drove her to seize control so meticulously? Did she act out of vengeance, survival, ambition, or a mixture of all three? And perhaps most haunting of all, did she anticipate the ripple effect of her actions for the generations to come, knowing that her shadow would stretch long beyond her lifetime? The story of Sarah at Wikliffe Plantation is not just a story of power gained, it is a study of human nature, hierarchy, and the unexpected ways in which history can bend to the will of one person. It teaches that appearances are deceiving, that fear can be wielded as a tool, and that even the most rigid structures can be transformed by intellect and strategy. And so, as the sun sets over the red Georgia soil and the oaks sway silently in the wind, one truth remains. The Abominable One was never ordinary, never predictable, and never truly understood. Those who attempt to measure her life in simple terms, bales of cotton, hours of labor, or social standing, fail to see the subtle, terrifying genius of a woman who reshaped an entire plantation without firing a single shot, and left a legacy that continues to whisper from the pages of forgotten ledgers. By the time Sarah had fully settled into her role at Wikliffe Plantation, the transformation she had quietly orchestrated was becoming impossible to ignore. What had begun as subtle influence over the domestic staff had expanded into near-total mastery of the estate's operations. Every detail, from the schedule of laborers to the allocation of supplies, ran with a precision that no overseer could match. Thaddeus Havford, for all his meticulousness, began to realize that the estate was no longer entirely his own. It was subtly, invisibly, under Sarah's control. Yet no one could point to a single moment when power had shifted. It was like watching the tide change, gradual, unstoppable, and undeniable once it had passed. Sarah's intelligence, observation, and patience were her greatest weapons. She knew the weaknesses of every individual on the plantation, from the youngest field hand to Thaddeus himself. She understood the dynamics of fear, ambition, and pride, and she manipulated them with a surgeon's precision. Conflicts that might have escalated into violence were neutralized before they could begin. Resources that were once wasted were now accounted for meticulously. And while others whispered about her strange abilities, Sarah remained calm, quiet, and deliberate, never revealing the full scope of her control. Her presence became the measure of order. Workers aligned their schedules around her movements, managers deferred to her judgment, and even Thaddeus found himself consulting her before making critical decisions. This invisible power was far more effective than any command or punishment. It created dependence, respect, and fear, all in equal measure. Sarah's influence extended beyond the plantation grounds. Neighboring planters and traders began to notice anomalies in Thaddeus's estate. Higher yields, fewer losses, and the mysterious efficiency of operations that no one could explain. Rumors spread of a woman who had arrived abominable, in appearance yet wielded an intelligence and authority that outmatched every man in Hancock County. Some spoke of her as a shadow, others as a force of nature. Inside the main house, Thaddeus became increasingly reliant on her counsel. What began as informal suggestions evolved into strategic advice that guided the plantation's finances, crop rotation, and labor management. He found himself questioning his own instincts, recognizing that Sarah's judgments, though delivered quietly, were invariably correct. And yet, there was no sign of overt ambition on her part. She never sought titles, recognition, or status. Her ascent was entirely calculated, a slow accumulation of influence that left everyone unaware of the true depth of her power until it was too late. As the years passed, Sarah's knowledge of the estate's wealth became profound. She understood which cotton crops were most profitable, which equipment required urgent attention, and how minor inefficiencies could cost thousands of dollars. She used this knowledge not to boast, but to consolidate her position subtly, ensuring that Thaddeus depended on her insight for the survival of the plantation. It was in the 7th year after her arrival that events reached a turning point. Thaddeus fell ill, his health deteriorating rapidly. The management of the estate required decisions he could no longer make alone. Sarah, with quiet authority, began to direct critical operations. She controlled the distribution of resources, organized labor shifts, and even managed correspondence with suppliers and neighboring estates. The plantation, once a place where Thaddeus's authority was absolute, now functioned under her guidance. And then, the unexpected happened. A dispute among workers threatened to erupt into violence, a situation that could have undermined the estate's productivity. Sarah intervened, not with anger, but with calm strategy. She understood the personal grievances, ambitions, and fears at play, and she orchestrated a resolution that satisfied all parties while simultaneously consolidating her influence. Witnesses later described the scene as astonishing. A woman once feared and ostracized had become the invisible hand that maintained order and prosperity. Her reputation spread beyond the estate. Traders, planters, and even local officials began to speak in hushed tones about the woman who had mastered Wikliffe. Some attributed her success to supernatural ability, others to cunning intelligence, but all agreed on one point: she was extraordinary. Yet even as her power grew, Sarah remained disciplined. She never flaunted her authority, never sought recognition, and never acted impulsively. Every decision was measured, every action deliberate. She understood that true influence lay in subtlety, in shaping outcomes before anyone realized they were being influenced. And while Thaddeus remained alive, her power was exercised quietly, invisible yet absolute. When Thaddeus finally passed away, the estate's control seamlessly transitioned. Sarah orchestrated his funeral, managed the estate's assets, and ensured that no single action threatened her newly consolidated power. State officials were drawn into the aftermath due to irregularities, but even they were unable to comprehend the depth of her planning. Their reports were sealed, hidden away for decades, leaving only whispers of the truth behind closed doors. The transformation of Sarah from an outcast to the undisputed mistress of Wikliffe Plantation was not a story of chance. It was the product of meticulous observation, patient calculation, and a profound understanding of human behavior. She had turned fear into respect, subjugation into authority, and invisibility into absolute influence. Her rise was methodical, her power undeniable, and her legacy enduring. Scholars who later studied the archives would describe her not merely as a figure of history, but as a force, a reminder that intelligence, patience, and subtlety can be more powerful than brute strength or authority. Yet questions remained. What motivated her drive for control? Was it vengeance, ambition, survival, or a combination of all three? Did she anticipate the long-term consequences of her actions, or did she act only in the immediate moment? And perhaps most hauntingly, did anyone truly understand the full scope of her mastery? The story of Sarah at Wikliffe Plantation stands as a study of power, perception, and the ways in which a single individual can reshape a world built on order and hierarchy. She demonstrated that true mastery lies not in overt dominance, but in quiet influence, in the ability to read people, anticipate events, and shape outcomes without ever being seen as the force behind them. And so, as the oak trees of Hancock County sway silently over the red soil, the legacy of the Abominable One continues to whisper from the pages of forgotten ledgers. Her story reminds us that appearances deceive, that the underestimated can become the most powerful, and that the quietest presence may wield the greatest influence. And still, there is one final truth to consider. Though her life is documented, the full extent of her intellect, strategy, and subtlety may never be known. Some forces are too complex, too patient, and too calculated to be fully understood. And Sarah, the woman once feared for her appearance, had become precisely that, a force of history, impossible to ignore and impossible to forget. As the years passed, Wikliffe Plantation continued to thrive, but beneath its flourishing surface lay the invisible imprint of a woman who had mastered it all. She had rewritten the rules, turned fear into power, and ensured that no one, neither overseer, neighbor, nor official, could challenge the order she had created. And those who glimpsed her influence could not help but wonder, how had a woman once deemed abominable come to shape an entire estate, leaving even the most meticulous men in awe of her genius? By the time the 8th year of Sarah's presence at Wikliffe arrived, the estate had undergone a transformation so profound that it was almost unrecognizable to those who had once walked its grounds. The workers, once hesitant and fearful of the Abominable One, now moved with a mix of reverence and caution, aware that every action, no matter how small, could be observed and subtly influenced. Sarah's authority had spread quietly but comprehensively. She had infiltrated every aspect of the plantation's operations without ever seeming to assert herself overtly. Even the most skeptical overseers began to recognize her intuition as uncanny, almost preternatural. It was not merely that she could anticipate problems before they arose, but that she seemed to orchestrate solutions in ways that made her influence appear invisible. The estate, under her guidance, ran with a precision that rivaled the efficiency of Thaddeus Havford's own obsessive record-keeping. But now it was imbued with something far more dangerous: human cunning. Sarah had discovered early on that direct confrontation was unnecessary. The human mind, once understood, could be manipulated with subtlety and patience. She noted the weaknesses of every individual: pride, greed, fear, ambition, and used these traits as instruments to guide behavior without revealing her hand. Conflicts that might have escalated into rebellion or violence were diffused before they began. Decisions made by Thaddeus himself were quietly influenced by her advice, often delivered with a calm, unassuming tone that left him unaware of the extent to which he was being guided. Outside the estate, whispers about the Abominable One grew into legends. Neighboring planters speculated about her methods. How could a woman once shunned for her appearance wield such influence over a thriving plantation? Rumors of supernatural abilities, of clever manipulation, and even of secret alliances spread quietly through the region. Yet Sarah never acted to confirm or deny these stories. Her strategy relied on ambiguity. The unknown amplified fear, respect, and influence. Within the main house, Sarah's control was absolute, though invisible. The domestic staff operated under her guidance as if by instinct. The records she managed were flawless, and resources that once disappeared or were mismanaged were accounted for down to the last detail. Thaddeus, increasingly reliant on her counsel, found himself doubting his own judgment in subtle ways, trusting her advice even when it contradicted his initial instincts. This quiet dominance reached its apex when Thaddeus's health began to fail rapidly. Sarah, always patient, had been observing for this precise moment. She knew that the time for subtle influence was ending, and the moment for direct consolidation of authority was approaching. She orchestrated daily routines, labor distribution, and the management of the estate's finances with a precision that left no room for error. The plantation ran as if guided by a single, unerring mind. When Thaddeus finally passed away, the transition of power was almost imperceptible. Sarah had already embedded herself into the mechanisms of control, ensuring that the estate's fortune, workers, and legacy were under her command. Even state officials, called in to investigate irregularities surrounding Thaddeus's death and the estate's management, could not uncover the depth of her planning. Their reports, though detailed, captured only fragments of her influence, and these were sealed away for over a century. Sarah's mastery extended beyond logistics. It was psychological, social, and financial. She understood the social hierarchy of Hancock County, the ambitions of neighboring planters, and the fears of the enslaved population. Every action she took was designed to reinforce her authority while maintaining the illusion that she was merely a servant within a rigid system. By controlling perceptions, she controlled reality. The Abominable One had become not merely a manager, but the undisputed mistress of Wikliffe Plantation, a position secured without violence, rebellion, or confrontation. Her rise demonstrated a terrifying truth. True power lies not in brute force, but in observation, calculation, and the patient application of influence. She had learned the rules of the world she entered and bent them to her will with precision that bordered on genius. Yet, for all her mastery, Sarah's story was not merely one of triumph. It was a study in isolation, strategy, and the hidden costs of absolute control. To maintain authority, she had to remain vigilant at all times, never revealing weakness, never allowing doubt to show, and constantly monitoring those around her. The mental and emotional discipline required to sustain such control was immense, and she bore it silently, as if the very survival of Wikliffe depended upon her unflinching focus. Those who witnessed her influence could sense it, even if they could not define it. Workers moved with careful attention, overseers deferred to her subtly, and Thaddeus's advisors found themselves aligning with her guidance without fully realizing why. The power she wielded was invisible but absolute, like a tide that could not be resisted. Stories of Sarah's extraordinary abilities circulated in whispers. Some claimed she possessed uncanny foresight, others that she could manipulate individuals without uttering a word. Legends grew, blending truth and speculation into a narrative so compelling that it outlasted the memories of those who had known her personally. And yet, Sarah did not cultivate these stories. They arose naturally from the way she carried herself, the precision of her actions, and the quiet, undeniable results she achieved. It was this combination of subtlety, intelligence, and patience that made her legacy so enduring. By the time the decade closed, Wikliffe Plantation had become a testament to Sarah's skill, an estate that thrived under a woman once feared and dismissed. Every process, every record, every laborer's action was guided by her insight. And though the plantation appeared prosperous and orderly to outsiders, it was Sarah's invisible hand that maintained the delicate balance. The final and most remarkable aspect of her transformation was psychological. She had changed the perception of herself from abominable to indispensable, from feared outsider to central authority. By mastering the minds of those around her, she secured her position not merely through action, but through belief. Thaddeus had trusted her judgment, the workers respected it, and even those outside the estate could sense her influence without ever encountering her directly. In a world governed by hierarchy, appearances, and rigid tradition, Sarah had become the apex, not through rebellion, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, unrelenting application of intellect and strategy. And yet, for all her power, there remained questions that lingered. How had she anticipated every challenge? What drove her relentless focus and meticulous observation? Could anyone truly comprehend the depths of her influence? The answers remained hidden, as did much of her private life, concealed in the very ledger that had first recorded her arrival. What was evident, however, was undeniable. A woman once deemed a social outcast and physically abnormal had reshaped the destiny of one of Georgia's most prosperous plantations, leaving a legacy that whispered through the halls, cabins, and fields long after her presence became a legend. And still, Sarah waited, always calculating, always observing, ensuring that every thread of influence remained under her control. The quiet mastery she wielded was a force few could recognize, and fewer still could resist. As the sun set over the red soil of Hancock County, the oak trees casting long shadows over the meticulously tended fields, one truth was clear: the Abominable One had become something more than a figure in history. She had become a presence that shaped reality itself, a reminder that patience, intelligence, and subtlety can outweigh brute force, and that the quietest person may ultimately hold the greatest power. And as the estate thrived under her watchful eye, those who dared to speculate could only wonder what other unseen forces were at work, what calculations were still unfolding, and what Sarah's next move might be, in a world where the rules had been rewritten by a woman no one had truly understood. The years at Wikliffe Plantation had changed everything. What had started as a simple transaction, the arrival of a young woman, scarred and feared, had evolved into a story of calculated mastery that few could comprehend. Sarah, the woman once labeled abominable, now held complete sway over the estate, its wealth, its workers, and even the legacy of Thaddeus Havford. By this point, the plantation thrived under a meticulous order that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. Sarah had achieved what no one thought possible. She had taken a position once defined by servitude and invisibility and transformed it into absolute authority, all without the use of overt violence or confrontation. Every individual on the estate, from laborer to overseer, acted in ways subtly guided by her hand. Conflicts were preempted, resources optimized, and daily operations orchestrated with a precision that made the estate almost untouchable. Her strategy was simple yet devastatingly effective: observe, calculate, and manipulate the unseen levers of human behavior. She knew ambition when she saw it, fear when it flickered, and pride when it could be bent, and she wielded these tools with the patience of a general planning a campaign decades in advance. Thaddeus Havford's death, which might have destabilized any other plantation, instead marked the final step in Sarah's ascendancy. Because she had positioned herself as indispensable, she assumed control with a seamless authority that left outsiders baffled. State officials investigating irregularities found only fragments of her influence, details too subtle for them to fully comprehend, and they sealed their reports, leaving history itself to whisper her story. Yet it was not merely the mechanics of control that defined her. Sarah had reshaped perception. Where once she was feared for her appearance and considered cursed or dangerous, now she was respected, even revered. Workers deferred to her, overseers consulted her judgment, and even neighboring planters acknowledged, in secret, that the estate ran with a quality unmatched anywhere in Hancock County. But what made Sarah truly remarkable was not her control of people, nor her management of wealth and labor, but the psychological and social architecture she had created. She had mastered the minds of those around her, guiding behavior with subtlety and precision, ensuring that her authority was never openly challenged. She transformed fear into compliance, invisibility into influence, and patience into power. Her mastery of the human element, the unseen, unpredictable force that often undermined even the most carefully planned operations, was her greatest weapon. And yet, despite all this, she never allowed pride or arrogance to surface. Every action, every decision, was deliberate, measured, and designed to consolidate control without exposing vulnerability. Her brilliance lay in her restraint, in her ability to exercise power quietly, invisibly, yet absolutely. It was this quiet genius that ensured the legacy of the Abominable One endured. Even decades later, when scholars studied the plantation's ledgers and accounts, they could only partially reconstruct her methods. The full depth of her strategy, the psychological acuity, the meticulous observation, the patient orchestration remained largely invisible, understood only by those who had lived through her quiet revolution. Yet questions persisted. What drove her? Was it survival, revenge, ambition, or a mixture of all three? Did she anticipate the ripple effects of her actions for generations to come? Some believed she had, noting how every detail seemed meticulously calculated, from worker management to financial oversight to the careful concealment of her strategies from state officials. And there was the final, haunting truth. The greatest power often lies not in what is seen, but in what is hidden. Sarah had mastered the art of invisibility, of influence without exposure, and in doing so, she became a figure both feared and revered, remembered not just for what she did, but for the subtlety, intelligence, and patience with which she did it. By the end of her tenure, Wikliffe Plantation had become more than a profitable estate. It was a testament to the capabilities of one extraordinary individual, a living proof that influence and control can be achieved without physical domination, and that perception can be as powerful as reality. Sarah's story is a reminder that history is often shaped not by those who shout the loudest, but by those who observe, calculate, and act with quiet precision. And as the oak trees of Hancock County swayed over the red soil, casting long shadows over the fields and cabins, the legacy of the Abominable One whispered still from the pages of forgotten ledgers. Her story serves as a warning and a lesson that underestimated individuals, guided by intellect, patience, and subtlety, can reshape the world around them, bending it to their will without ever revealing the true extent of their power. For those who study the past, the tale of Sarah at Wikliffe Plantation is more than a historical curiosity. It is a study in strategy, psychology, and the enduring power of intelligence. It teaches that fear can be a tool, that observation can be a weapon, and that mastery does not require violence or rebellion. And so, the legend of the Abominable One endures, a reminder that the quietest presence can leave the deepest mark, that patience and intellect can outmatch brute force, and that the most profound transformations often occur without the world ever noticing until it is far too late. Among the thousands of plantation records preserved in the archives of rural Georgia, one ledger stands apart, a document so disturbing that local historians debated for decades whether to make it public. The entry, dated March 1851, describes a female slave whose appearance was considered so horrifying that overseers initially refused to work near her. Yet within 7 years, this same woman would own the entire estate, control its fortune, and orchestrate the burial of her master under circumstances that drew state officials into investigation. What happened at Wikliffe Plantation wasn't about forbidden desire or social transgression. It was about something far more calculated, far more sinister, and far more successful than anyone dared to admit. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called the Abominable One, understand this. Appearances could condemn you, but ambition, wielded with precision, could reshape destinies. Wikliffe Plantation stretched across 1,200 acres of prime cotton land in Hancock County, Georgia. By the late 1842, it had become one of the region's most profitable estates, producing over 300 bales per season. The main house, a Greek Revival structure with 6 fluted columns and a wraparound veranda, stood at the end of a quarter-mile oak-lined drive, announcing the Havford family's prominence long before visitors reached the front steps. Thaddeus Havford inherited the property in 1842, 31 years old, recently widowed, and burdened with debts that could have destroyed a lesser man. Every expenditure, every birth, every death, every pound of cotton was meticulously recorded in leather-bound ledgers he maintained personally. The plantation's workforce lived in 2 rows of cabins, each housing 8 to 12 people, separated only by thin cotton curtains. The work bell rang at 4:30 a.m., 6 days a week, while Sundays were reserved for mandatory attendance at circuit preacher services, emphasizing obedience, patience, and the promise of rewards in the afterlife. Hancock County society consisted of a small number of planter families, a merchant class, and transient overseers, traders, and craftsmen. Social hierarchies were rigid, maintained through marriage alliances, public events, and annual harvest balls. Thaddeus attended these functions dutifully but without enthusiasm, earning a reputation as a man more interested in profit margins than social climbing. His closest neighbor, Robert Crenshaw, owned the adjacent property, 1,100 acres, that consistently underperformed Wikliffe despite similar soil quality. The rivalry between them was polite but unmistakable, expressed through competitive bids at slave auctions and pointed remarks about yield per acre. The absence of a mistress at Wikliffe was noted, though not openly discussed. His sister Margaret had offered to relocate from Savannah to serve as hostess, but he declined repeatedly. He employed a housekeeper, a free woman of color named Della Puet, who managed domestic staff, ensuring meals appeared on time and linens remained crisp despite Georgia's humidity. It was into this carefully ordered world that Sarah arrived in October 1849. The slave coffle reached Wikliffe on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon, late due to the swollen Oconee River. 17 people emerged, exhausted from a 200-mile march in chains. Augustus Webb, the trader, warned Thaddeus that one woman, Sarah, was damaged goods. Her skin bore irregular patches of pale white tissue, sharply contrasting with her dark brown complexion. Overseers refused to work near her. Others whispered she was cursed or dangerous. Yet Thaddeus, intrigued, saw intelligence, discipline, and control in her stance. She was small in words but immense in presence. Over the following years, Sarah's influence grew quietly but irreversibly. She began with domestic management, organizing staff, accounting for supplies, and monitoring operations. Thaddeus found himself relying on her advice more often, gradually realizing that the estate's success was guided by her insight. By observing human behavior, the fears, ambitions, and pride of those around her, Sarah subtly manipulated outcomes without ever appearing forceful. Conflicts were diffused, resources optimized, and the plantation ran with a precision no overseer could achieve. Neighboring planters whispered about her intelligence and uncanny foresight. Some believed in supernatural abilities, others simply called it genius. When Thaddeus fell ill, Sarah took control seamlessly, managing labor distribution, finances, and correspondence with neighboring estates. By the 7th year, she had consolidated her power. Upon Thaddeus's death, the transition was imperceptible. State officials investigated irregularities but could not trace her influence. Their reports were sealed for decades. Sarah had mastered not only the mechanics of the estate, but the psychology of every person within it. She transformed fear into respect, invisibility into authority, and patience into power. By the end of the decade, Wikliffe thrived under her watchful eye, the estate's order and prosperity, a testament to her intellect, strategy, and subtle manipulation. Legends of her methods grew, blending fact and speculation, yet Sarah never confirmed nor denied them. Her brilliance lay in restraint, in the quiet exercise of absolute power. She became indispensable, her authority rooted in the perception of those around her as much as in her decisions. And so, some stories are whispered not because they are forgotten, but because they defy comprehension. Sarah's journey from outcast, feared for her appearance, to the invisible master of one of Georgia's most prosperous estates, is a study in patience, observation, and strategy. She reshaped a world built on hierarchy, fear, and appearances, leaving behind a legacy that whispers through the pages of forgotten ledgers. Her story reminds us that true power is often invisible, that the underestimated can become the most formidable, and that the quietest presence may leave the deepest mark. And though generations have passed, the question remains: how did a woman once deemed abominable come to wield such invisible, unstoppable power? Perhaps the full answer will never be known. Perhaps it still waits, patient and silent, like Sarah herself, watching from the shadows of history, reminding us that the quietest presence can reshape everything, and that some forces, once set in motion, cannot be resisted.